Your 401k is probably one of your biggest assets, and it's critical to understand how your account is doing. So that's what we'll cover here. We're going to go over investment returns and how you can compare and evaluate those. And then perhaps more importantly, we'll go over what's behind those returns. So what are the drivers behind whether you get good returns or bad returns? And all of this can apply to your IRAs and other types of accounts. So any changes in your account balance pretty much come from two sources. Number one, you've got additions and withdrawals, including fees, that can affect your account balance. And the other is investment performance. And that's what we're going to focus on mostly here. So the gains and losses in your accounts. Although we'll also talk about the importance of contribution amounts. So this might end up being the world's most basic review for some of you if you already know all about your 401k and how the returns work. But for others who are just starting to wrap their brains around what's happening in their accounts, I think this is going to be helpful. So let's start with a personal rate of return. Whenever it's available, this is probably the easiest way to start understanding what's happening in your account. But you also want to evaluate your investments separately because the personal rate of return has some things that can muddy the waters. The personal rate of return describes your account performance as an annualized rate of return. We'll talk about that in a second. And this is different from the published rate of return on the investments you chose. That's because a personal rate accounts for the timing of any contributions and withdrawals. So if you just look at the investments you used, you can look up their returns and they show you how they performed, but you didn't necessarily buy at the exact beginning of that period. So if you look at the 1 year return, you didn't necessarily buy at the beginning of that 1 year period. So the personal rate of return is really specific to your account. In particular, that rate is going to account for your investment returns with the timing of additions, any withdrawals you took, any investment gains or losses, and any fees. And just to cover the basics here, a return is the percentage that tells you how much you made, and we can convert that to a dollar. We will in a minute here. So if you have $1,000 and you gain 10% over a year, you would have an extra 10%, which is an extra $100 or $1,100 at the end of the year in your account. Now, this is an oversimplified example, and it's just 1 year, but hopefully that paints the picture. To show you how to do some of this math, you could take that $1,000, you have a 10% return. And by the way, returns or percentages are often done as decimals. You can convert it to a percent. But if you wanted to do 6%, for example, you'd do 0.06, and that is the equivalent of 6%. So the return in dollars equals it already did that for me, didn't it? That times that is a $100 return. And then at the end of the year, we would have that plus that for a total of $1,100. And then, of course, as your return changes, you might have a 4% return, you made $40, and you would have $1,040 at the end of that period. If we look at a sample of a 401k statement, this is going to show you, it actually says your personal rate of return. And this is typical of account statements, or when you log in online, you can often find a section that says your personal rate of return. So they show for the latest period was 4.75% positive. That's up, that's good. The last 12 months was 11.01. I don't know if you necessarily need 2 decimal points as you figure all this out, but it may be interesting. And then they show since inception. So they are again showing you a personal rate of return that actually differs from the investment returns of the actual investments you chose. So you've got a menu of investments, and that's got a lot of different choices on it. And all of those are going to have different characteristics and different returns. So again, the personal rate is specific to your account because it tracks every time you buy or when you shift money between accounts. That's possibly also going to have an impact. And you might think of this as investment versus investor returns. So you are the investor. That's how did you do in your account. And the investment is how did the investment itself do. But again, the investment tracks a period that isn't necessarily exactly when you bought. In fact, you're probably buying, let's say, every 2 weeks with every pay period in your 401k, whereas so that's the investor, but the investment is just, the past 1, 3, or 5 years, assuming that you started right at the very beginning of that period. The returns are typically annualized over long periods, so that tells you if you earned the same rate every year how much that rate of return would have been. But you didn't earn the same exact rate every year in most cases. Markets go up, they go down, and some years you lose money, some years you gain a lot, some years you gain a little. So the annualized rate kind of evens all of that out for you. Here's an example that I don't necessarily love, but it does help to start painting the picture. The reality is a little bit more complicated. So they say if you contributed $100 and 5 years later you had 125, that's a return of 25% or a cumulative return of 25%. So that sounds pretty good, but if you annualize it, it's really more like 5% per year. Now, the actual number is probably not exactly 5%. It just depends on the timing and everything. We're going to get into some of those complications, but not too deeply a little bit later. The idea here, though, is they're going to try and tell you roughly what was the equivalent, because you might have made that whole 25% in the last year, or you might have made it in the first year and then things just sat stagnant. We just don't know. Tracking all of those contributions is a lot of work, and you don't necessarily have to do that. Your 401k provider probably does it for you. So again, you're just going to see that personal rate of return most likely right when you log in or on your statements. So the plan providers and other investment providers have been showing this for quite a few years. And it's nice to look at your return over different timelines. So you might want to know how you're doing year to date. That's a pretty short time period, but maybe it's useful. And then you can also look at the past 3 to 5 years if your account was open that long. And if you're wondering exactly how they calculate that personal rate of return, it can vary from provider to provider. So you really need to review the support information and the disclosures to understand what assumptions are involved. But vendors will sometimes use a money-weighted return or an internal rate of return. Once again, you do want to also look at the actual returns of the investments you're using, not just your personal rate of return, because the personal rate of return takes timing into account and you don't necessarily control that. Plus, your personal rate doesn't necessarily tell you if you picked good or bad investments. And that's because your timing might have been good or bad. Maybe you switched jobs and rolled money over and the timing happened to be particularly interesting. So it's the actual investments themselves as well that you want to look at. It's really hard to do comparisons of a personal rate because you would have to set up a system, and you can do this, but you would have to set something up where you're contributing a specific amount every pay period to a similar portfolio of investments, and that's not the easiest thing to achieve. But if you just look at the general investment results of the options you're using in your plan, that can help you figure out if they're relatively good or relatively bad. And how do you do that? You compare them. So what is the average rate of return in 401k plans? Like, how can you tell if you're doing well or not doing so well? Well, your investment returns depend on things like timing and which investments you choose and what the economy's doing and do you make any changes and other factors. If you go searching, you're going to find that people claim numbers between, let's say, 5 and 8% per year average annual returns, but there's really no way to name a specific number that people are getting. Every investor is different, so returns are really all over the board. It would be nice if there were a simple answer, but there's not. Fortunately, there are at least 2 sources you can consult for some insight. For example, the most recent data from Vanguard shows a personal rate of return in retirement plans of about 4.2% per year over the most recent 5-year period available. But that information is a little bit dated. It was negative 15.9% for the previous 1-year period. And the study also tells us that on average, investors in 401k plans have about 80 to 90% of their accounts in stocks. But you might not have that much stock. In fact, most people approaching retirement don't. So that number might not apply to you. By the way, you can look this up yourself every year and see if the data is more recent. You're just going to search for Vanguard's report called How America Saves and then start digging through the pages. Again, that 5-year period was unique and the next 5 years may be different. So it's really hard to make use of this information, but understandably, you probably want to evaluate how you're doing. And that might include comparing yourself to others and you may wonder how much you should be earning in your accounts. So what is a good rate of return? Well, that depends on what the markets were doing recently. So you can compare your personal rate of return as well as the general rates of returns of the investments you're using. You can compare those returns to market indices like the S&P 500 or the aggregate bond index. But you want to be mindful of risk, because if you have a 60-40 portfolio, for example, that's 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds, you don't want to compare that to the S&P 500 because it's not apples to apples. The S&P 500 is 100% large US company stocks. Fortunately, there are some good sources out there. So one good place to find benchmarks for comparison is Morningstar. So you can look up, for example, a 60-40 index, and that will tell you how did it do over recent periods. You can click on performance and it'll show you the total return. That's the return of the market movement plus dividend reinvestment over various time periods. So you can say, well, how did my investments do compared to that? Or what's my personal rate compared to that? Again, we're looking at a 60-40 here. So if that doesn't fit you, then you need to find an index that is a better fit. And as you review the numbers, remember that you cannot invest directly in an index, and fees will reduce your returns. So 401k plans typically charge administrative and record keeping and other types of charges, so keep that in mind. Ultimately, there's really no way to know what a good return is in advance. The only question you can answer is whether you got reasonable returns given whatever the market delivered. So if markets rose sharply, you might hope to have high returns, but if markets fell, you might hope to have lost less. Ultimately, you're just along for the ride, and as long as you use an appropriate risk level and investment strategy, you don't necessarily need to compare your returns. You get what you get, as they say. But again, you have to do a good job of setting things up, which we'll get into in a bit. It's also important to acknowledge that returns are not necessarily the biggest piece of the equation. For example, your rate of return might be a lot less important than how much you add to your accounts. This is especially true when you have a relatively short time period before you need the money. So we might say that you're investing, let's say, $10,000 a year with a 6% return, and you've got 10 years to go. What if you could just double the return? Well, we can look at the baseline there. If you were doing the 6% return, 10,000 a year, you'd have about 148, 149,000 at the end of that 10-year period. If you doubled the return by earning more, you'd have 195,000. That's a nice increase. But if you just kept that same return and instead were able to double your savings, in other words, save 20,000 per year instead of 10, you would have about 300,000, which is more than if you could just double the return. Obviously, it's easier said than done. They're both a bit of a stretch. You know, if you can just double your return or double the amount you're saving each year, neither is easy. But the impact of doubling the amount you save is greater over these shorter time periods, and it's a little different over long time periods. Because the future is uncertain, all you can do is do a good job of setting things up and go along for the ride. So if you're finding this helpful, please leave a quick thumbs up. So what affects your returns? This might be more important to know than what your actual return was down to 3 decimal points, because again, you can't control what the markets do. You can make decisions that put you in a good or a less good position for whatever the markets are going to do. One factor is risk. So how much of your money is in stocks versus bonds versus cash? So more exposure to stocks is higher on the risk to return spectrum. So you might have higher returns, especially over the long term, but you might also have large losses or flat returns, and you might not have time to recover from any losses. Timing is also a biggie. You might have gains or losses depending on when those contributions hit your account or when you switch investments or switch accounts. So timing the markets is really difficult to achieve consistently over any long period. You might get relatively lucky or unlucky, but timing is dangerous to count on. Expenses can also reduce returns, and they might not have as big of an impact as risk or timing, but they can be relevant. And if you have a small account, any flat dollar fees can take kind of a big bite out of your assets. And on the other hand, if you have large balances in your accounts, a percentage-based fee, especially a high one, can really add up to sizable costs. Then there's investment selection, and this probably gets the most attention for some reason. The specific investments you choose might affect your returns, but the role of any individual security might or might not be that important. So again, it comes to mainly risk, how much stock versus bonds, and some other factors. Now, in many 401k plans, you have a limited menu of investments. And so you might have some options, for better or worse, not necessarily a good thing, to favor certain areas of the markets or to use different strategies. But investment selection might deserve less attention. You're probably going to be just fine using relatively low cost passive type strategies for the most part. If you have negative returns, that is never fun to see. But if it's any consolation, it is normal to see some losses, especially over short periods of time. That's part of investing in the markets and pursuing more long-term growth that hopefully, no guarantees, but hopefully outpaces inflation. Over longer periods, ideally you will recover. Again, no guarantees, but the returns tend to be more likely positive, at least looking at history, over longer periods. And, over a 1-year period, anything is possible. You could have big gains or big losses. So you might be taking an appropriate amount of risk in your portfolio if you have the right amount of stocks versus bonds, for example, and you've got your money spread out over lots of different areas of the markets, and you're using pretty simple, plain vanilla type funds, maybe low cost index funds. But if you've been timing the market or making specific bets on stocks or certain sectors, for example, that can also be a cause for losses that you might want to do something about. That might not be the best way to invest. Again, it could work out for you, who knows? But the textbook would not say that that's the best way to go. So how can you calculate your returns? Well, I feel conflicted on this because on the one hand, having that number figured out, again, down to 3 decimal places or something, doesn't necessarily give you insight. It gives you information, but I'm not sure how useful it is. What's more important is typically the decisions you make. How much risk? What's the timing, if any? Hopefully none. And what are the investments you're using? Are they high quality type investments? But if you do want to calculate your returns, the easiest way is with an online calculator. And remember that there are different ways to calculate your returns. Now, I'm going to include a link in the description below that goes into a lot of detail. This video I'm doing is not the video for that, but you can get a lot more detail on the different calculation methodologies, and you can decide which one you want to use. But for now, let's say we're going to use this calculator. And the reason for that is because if you kind of back into the calculation, you reverse what you're doing on this calculator, it matches the SEC's calculator. So I wanted to give you some consistency there. So we're going to assume you started out with $50,000. You can make that zero. You added $1,000 a month. You can, again, enter whatever number you want. I'm going to have a link to this in the description. You invest for 10 years, and then you end up at the end of the period with $250,000. So what was the return? Well, this calculator shows a return that is 5.879%. And so you would cross-check that with another calculator. You should always do that using internet calculators. So we're going to go to the SEC's calculator and kind of go through this backwards. Going to enter 5.88%, close enough, and we get to a pretty similar result here. So that tells you that the 5.8-ish is a reasonable amount to tell you for your return. And again, there are multiple ways to do it. This is just one of them. And this also assumes some pretty simplistic inputs, and that might not match your situation. So if you need to model something more complex, you're probably going to need to build a spreadsheet, which introduces additional challenges and risks of things going astray. So once again, I think it's more important to focus on those drivers of the returns and not the numbers themselves. It's kind of like a credit score where you can get your credit score, you know what the number is, but knowing the number doesn't make it go up. You really have to, pay your bills on time, deal with any outstanding issues out there, have a nice mix of credit, a long credit history. Again, all of the inputs on your credit report are what create the credit score. And similarly, the decisions you make and whatever the market happens to deliver, positive, negative, or flat, that's what's going to determine your returns. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please leave a quick thumbs up. Thank you and take care.